Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Hey, ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association, is a fantastic organisation. They are sponsoring this episode of Knowing Animals. Have you been to their Facebook page? They have a wonderful Facebook page. I contribute to it regularly. They also have a website and they hold a conference every 2 years. Okay, now this episode of Knowing Animals is coming to you from lovely Brisbane town, where it's a little bit of an overcast day, but it's certainly still much, much warmer than in many other parts of Australia. Now, I'm lucky to be joined by Professor Clive Phillips. Clive is Chair of Animal Welfare and Director of the Centre for Animal Welfare and Ethics in the School of Veterinary Science at the University of Queensland. And today we're going to be discussing Clive's book, The Animal Trade, which was published in 2015. So welcome to the podcast, Clive.
Thank you.
So Clive, why this book? What inspired you?
I think over a number of years I'd been observing and involved in the animal trade, and I guess I got to a point where I felt I really had something that I wanted to say about the issues connected with the trade, and trying to look a bit to the future and how meat production and consumption is increasing pretty rapidly in many parts of the world, and therefore the trade in meat. And that was one of the things I wanted to address. Where is this taking us as a human species? Where are we going to be in 50 years?
So you take a historical approach to the issue, and it was very interesting. A lot of the history of animal trade over many hundreds of years that I'd not thought about and didn't know about. Why do you want people to think about this issue in a historical context?
I thought it was relatively undescribed. People hadn't considered the history of the animal trade, and I've always thought that, unless you know where you've come from and where the trade's been, you really can't predict where it's going in the future. And as it turned out, the more I delved into it, the more I saw that animal issues and trade in animals was at the root of a lot of important decisions over historical time.
So can you, for people who haven't had the chance to read the book yet, can you tell us something about those historical roots or the origins of animal trade?
Going back a long time, we see that animals were initially used as a currency, shells, and going back many thousands of years, and that continued until even recent times, where animals are considered an important source of capital in Africa currently. But many of those major disastrous wars that we saw in the last century were decided on and fought over partly as a result of animal trade issues. The availability of meat in particular was instrumental in deciding the outcome of, to some extent, both the First and the Second World War. So we saw that the animal trade over the centuries was very, very important.
So, of course, your book starts historically, but then looks at the contemporary context and contemporary issues very heavily. As you note in your book, there is a lot of global policy around trade, so it's not something that's just negotiated, it is managed. How would you describe the international global trade policy as it currently is? What are the key features?
I guess there's not one trading policy per se, although the World Trade Organization, of course, has a major impact on trading policy. And there are some global standards, guidelines, which have localized impact, I think. I don't think anyone would say that the World Animal Health Organization guidelines are yet having major impact. So what we have, I think, is quite a plethora of different policies, and they are very politically connected. I mean, some of them are changed on a whim, and I give in the book, I think, an example of how the trade between Russia and Europe has been greatly influenced by the recent issues between those two regions, and with products being banned. And even more recently, I mean, since the book was written, we've seen the trade between China and the United States in pork products being impacted. So trade sanctions are quite a major tool because food is so important in all our lives. The threat of trade sanctions and the imposition of trade sanctions has been used repeatedly to have a major impact on the peoples in a country. I think it's a means of almost twisting the arm of the general people by saying here's an essential product, or what many people would consider an essential product, which we are going to restrict your access to unless you do such and such. And the political parties know that that's really important.
So this brings us to another significant theme in your book, and a very important theme, which is meat consumptions and volume of meat consumptions. And you document very large increases in the volume of meat consumption around the world and among particular populations. Can you explain to us what you found in relation to that issue?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think many of us in the developed world feel that meat consumption is certainly not going up, and there is quite a lot of publicity around some of the bad influences that high level of meat consumption can have on water use, on our health, on our ethics. And so the general emphasis tends to be, well, we don't need to be concerned about meat consumption. It's stabilized. It may even be declining in certain parts of the world, and indeed it is. But the dominant trend worldwide is for meat consumption to rise quite rapidly, and this is mainly because of economic feasibility of consuming meat, particularly in Asia, and to a lesser extent in South America. And the other thing which most people in developed countries may not be aware of is that meat production has largely moved, or is moving, to developing countries. So although we may be talking about not producing meat in poor circumstances, with excessive use of resources, that's all happening in developing countries. And they've taken our intensive production systems really as a model for their own systems.
So is there any reason to believe or to think that the volume of animals being produced for meat has declined or will decline overall globally, or is it really just going upwards?
It's a varied pattern, and what's happening is that it's becoming focused into a small group of high-producing countries. So we're seeing specialization. Brazil for chicken meat production, for example, and to a lesser extent for cattle production. Thailand for chicken meat production, and also Southeast Asia for invertebrates, prawns, shrimps, etc. So it's becoming regionalized in really a massive way, and this is because of the involvement of big industrial companies. There's been a very rapid transition away from the family farm and towards really what to most people would be massive industrial complexes producing these animals. I mean, I remember when I was a bit younger than I am now, It used to be that a 100-cow dairy farm was pretty big. I can remember even thinking that this was a sort of natural ceiling to how many cows one man can look after. Usually was a man, unfortunately, in those days. But nowadays we're seeing many units springing up in China and other parts of Asia, and even some in Europe as well, which have several thousand cows. So really massive units. The same with feedlots, they're really becoming very big. And although this might play into the hands of the big industrial companies, they get large volumes of product relatively quickly and in an assured way, and the quality is more or less guaranteed. The efficiency of producing animals in that way is not good. Removal of the waste products is a problem. The industrial scale of the process leads to a lot of welfare issues. And so it's generally not a desirable move. And also, it's not sustaining large numbers of people in viable work, because, these are the most efficient production systems from a human labor use point of view. So no longer is it one person per 100 cows. It's one person per 500 cows or 600 cows.
And then, as you note in the book, the product, which is the meat, has to be transported around the world in order for consumers to be able to get access to it. Yeah.
Well, it's not just the product, of course, that has to be transported. It's all the ingredients for producing the product as well. So massive amounts of feed are now trawling the globe, much of it by sea. And this is partly in conjunction with our capacity to transport those materials by sea around the globe. Container shipping has increased enormously. And so large volumes of feed are sent from the United States to China, to Southeast Asia, to sustain that animal production.
So if you're someone who isn't perhaps particularly concerned about the lives and deaths of the animals, but you are concerned about your environmental footprint or green issues more generally, is there any way to eat meat in an environmentally friendly way, do you think?
Difficult question. One of the things I explore in the book is how the energetic efficiency of meat production is quite low. Compared with production of cereals, for example, cost of producing meat from an energetic perspective, would be 8 or 9 times that of producing cereals at least. But energy isn't the be-all and end-all of everything, because we have free energy from the sun if we use it properly. So we have to consider a range of inputs and how efficiently they're used. But although you can put your finger on any one of them and say, but what if you toast your cereals? You're putting in a vast amount of energy in the form of the toaster, so it's actually no more efficient than producing meat. You can put your finger at any one particular input, but generally meat production comes off very poorly in terms of the whole range of inputs that it has. Water use is one that's often cited, where it's taking hundreds of litres to produce just a kilogram of beef in places very often where that water is scarcely available.
Interesting. So we've talked about a range of issues, and including global supply chains and the need to move different items around the globe in order to produce animals, usually intensively in niche parts of the world. But of course, the elephant in the room is the live animal trade. That's perhaps the part of the global animal trade business that is most controversial. What do you have to say about live animal trades in your book?
I go into a lot of detail in the book about the various welfare problems that arise with the live animal trade, mainly because I think these aren't generally understood and known. we've had issues here in Australia recently with exposés revealing the terrible conditions that some sheep are transported in. And what amazes me is that so many people just say, well, I didn't know about that. It generally is not out, and I don't think the industry is very transparent in what's going on, and nor has it been willing to embrace change. There is so much that could be done if you just want to improve the trade. I mean, my own personal perspective would be that it's totally unnecessary. It'd be much better to slaughter and kill at source, and then the animals haven't got to go through that horrific process. So I do go into a lot of detail about the welfare problems. And I mean, I guess the reluctance on part of the trade to embrace change to some extent is understandable, because the conditions that many of them are transported under are very hard to fix. And not only that, but the unexpected can happen quite easily, quite suddenly. It's a fickle trade, and it's not just weather conditions that can blow up. It's political issues that arise. We had the Korma Express heading for Saudi Arabia in 2003, and when they got there was no capacity to unload the ship, and it was then trawling around the Middle East for about 6 weeks, and mortality rising all the time. These sort of issues happen with an alarming regularity several times a year, and yes, you get some voyages where mortality is very low, but mortality isn't the only measure of welfare. There are a lot of welfare problems on the ship which don't kill the animals. For instance, a very high ammonia concentration. And I've been on the ships, and I know that ammonia is very unpleasant, and the animals regard it as unpleasant for the entire 10 to 20 days that they're on the ship. And it's hard to fix. How do you get rid of vast volumes of excreta which the animals have produced on the ship? How do you control the high temperatures that they're exposed to when they leave Australia at sort of 4 degrees perhaps, and within 10 days they're up at 50 degrees and perhaps 80% humidity? How do you control for that? It's very, very hard.
Clive, that points to a really interesting issue that isn't kind of front and centre in your book, but I think is part of what comes to my mind when I speak to people such as yourself, which is, vets play a very complicated role in this process, as with many animal processes. So you're trained to provide care and relief, and presumably many people who go into veterinary science are very motivated to help animals, but at the same time you're also critically involved in animal activity, economic activity that perhaps is not in the animal's best interest. How do you balance all those things?
It's a very difficult balance, and I think one of the ways in which we like to try and ensure that a balanced perspective is achieved, well, 2 ways really. One is that vets are educated in ethical appraisal, and that they understand how to appraise the ethics and how to make a welfare decision, what is important for the animal's welfare. That's one part of it. And the flip side of the coin is that we must ensure that the veterinarians who are involved in the trade are truly independent. It's really no good having them paid directly by the shipping agents or the owners of the ships. They have to be independent, and there has to be accountability. So we've been looking at getting cameras onto ships, making proper recordings of temperature. We've been looking very carefully at veterinarians' reports, because the vets do make a daily report of conditions on the ship. Fortunately, we've had access to some of those, and we can now do some of the modelling which is required to see how bad the conditions really do get and how they can be ameliorated. Just as an example of that, the current system which industry has to try and cope with very hot conditions when sheep do make that journey from, 0 to 4 degrees up to 50 degrees in a very short period of time. The system that the industry uses is to try and predict the temperatures and to then say, okay, if it's going to be very hot, we won't stock with as many animals on board ship. We've been doing some modelling work on that, and our estimation is that the number of animals that you actually need to take off to try and control that temperature increase way exceeds the number that are actually on the ship. So I'm afraid that sort of tinkering at the edges, it just doesn't work. You need something much more dramatic for that than that. And I think the big push in recent times has been for the shipments in the Australian winter through to the Middle East to be banned effectively.
Interesting. Well, Clive, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes, I'll try and give 5 quick answers.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Wow. I studied as an agriculture student originally, and I don't think animal scholarship in what we now know it as even existed in those days. That was back in the 1970s. It simply didn't exist. I know the books had been written before that time, but in terms of an academic approach to animal welfare issues, it was really unheard of then. I began to get interested in animal welfare through in the early 1980s when I was studying nutrition of dairy cows. As would be normal in those days, you wouldn't embark on a PhD in welfare of animals in those days, or very rarely. But their welfare and the behavioural aspects of their nutrition intrigued me greatly. So I guess it would have been in the early 1980s I began to read some of the physiological aspects of how animals are responding to change. As an undergraduate, though, I do recall it would have been 1979, reading a lot about the impact of different shearing systems on Australian sheep, actually, even though I was in the heart of England at the time, and became quite intrigued with that, and particularly the sudden thermal changes that they experience and how that may influence their welfare. So I guess there might have even been a bit of foresight for my future move to Australia 30 years down the line.
So, and you weren't exposed to someone like Broom, Donald Broom, or something like that. Was he writing in that time?
No, he wasn't. He got his chair of animal welfare, the first chair of animal welfare in the world, I think in about 1985. I knew him before then, actually, when he was still at Reading, and we used to chat about welfare issues. And I think in the mid-80s, I invited him to the university that I started lecturing at in Bangor in North Wales. I invited him to come and talk about welfare to the students, and would have workshops. And he did that several years in a row. So, yes, I was, I wouldn't say one of his protégés, but I became acquainted with him at quite an early stage in the mid-1980s.
Interesting. So can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
That's sort of another hard question. The first thing I ever wrote was actually as an undergraduate, and I wrote to a farming journal, and I wanted to talk about the welfare issues around the shearing of sheep. I'd been reading about it a lot in Australia, and I thought that had something to say for what we were doing in England and the thermal changes in the sheep, and because sheep weren't designed to have a 2-inch thick woolly coat. They in their native form they have a much more hairy coat, which doesn't have that great insulatory value. So we've bred a sheep with this massively thick coat, and it really can be very difficult for the sheep to cope when we remove their coat when we shear them. And so I did write to a farming journal back in, it would have been about 1978, so long time ago.
And they were receptive?
Well, they published it.
Yeah, oh, there we go. So if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, I guess if you consider Donald Broom to be an animal studies scholar, then yes, he's had a big influence. I think in terms of his scientific approach to the subject, but also his being prepared to speak out when he felt something wasn't right. I mean, Donald is not necessarily your most outspoken critic of animal welfare in farming systems, because I mean he's got his own perspectives. I've got mine. They're not entirely the same. He's not vegetarian. I am. There are differences like that. But I think wherever he has got a strongly held opinion, he's very prepared to speak out regardless of the consequences. He and I do share something in common, actually, which is that we both hold held a chair in animal welfare in a university which is not industry sponsored. So most chairs I think I'm probably right in saying that most chairs in animal welfare around the world are supported by industry in some form or other. That doesn't mean to say that they're necessarily biased or aren't doing good research. Some of them are, but he who pays the piper.
Is it picks the tune or something like that?
Picks the tune, sorry, yes. He who pays the piper picks the tune. And it is fairly obvious that some chairs in animal welfare are not producing the sort of material which leads me to believe that they have a truly unbiased, independent view on what they're doing. And I have, I've said so on occasion publicly.
So, Clive, what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Well, I consider my role to be leading scientific endeavour to try and highlight some of the animal welfare injustices that there are around the world. Now, some of that, to an outsider might be seen as just proving the obvious. I mean, we did a piece of research recently where industry actually asked us to look at calf roping, which is a rodeo event where calves are wrestled to the ground in a relatively short period of time. And the industry felt that the calves weren't particularly stressed by the process. So they gave us some money to look at it, and surprise, surprise, we found that the calves were very stressed by, being chased by a rider on horseback and lassoed, brought abruptly to a halt, and then wrestled to the ground, lifted off the ground, and then dumped back down on it. We could have told you that before we did the research, but we needed to do that research to demonstrate to government that this process is causing physiological stress to the animals. I mean, we measured 3 stress hormones, and I wouldn't have predicted that all of them were necessarily going to respond to the stress, but they all did. And we also do a lot of behavioural work to try to find out how the animal is coping with the stresses that are imposed on it.
Interesting. So, Clive, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Well, I think it would be not to eat them. We're facing enormously challenging times, and I chart this at the end of my book. Over the next 50 years, if animal production and consumption goes on increasing in the way that it has been, in the way that it is in Asia. What worries me is that the world is becoming much more diversified in terms of income equality. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, despite what the FAO says. And what I see 50 years hence is that the rich will be able to continue eating their meat. They'll be paying a lot more for it, I've no doubt. But because of the massive use of resources that meat production requires, and milk production, of course, that there is a grave danger that we will see a major increase in malnutrition in some of the underdeveloped parts of the world. And Asia is changing very fast. There's no doubt there's a rising middle class. The lower classes have largely been left out of the changes, and I don't see a lot of evidence of that trickle-down factor which some refer to. But the real worry, I think, is Africa. Now, some Asian countries are being pretty smart and buying up large parts of Africa to help produce the food that they need in China, for example. But what's going to happen to the populations in Africa, 50 years down the line, when the rich countries have secured the capacity to produce meat? But what is going to happen to the people that have relied on the much more efficiently produced staple products, the cassava, the grains? It's a serious concern, and couple that with a lot of the difficulties we have in envisaging food production continuing to increase. So we've seen food production increase over the last couple of hundred years as predicted, but more recently, of course, that increase in food production has been at a significant environmental cost. And it's hard to see that can continue to be maintained. And the environmental costs comes as a result of the fact that the food has to be produced with high levels of fertilization of the ground, so that the natural fertility of the ground is insufficient. We have to pour significant amounts of chemicals onto the ground. And I just don't think that can be continued. And as a result, we will see a stabilization of food production levels, even going backwards in some regions. And that's not forecasting doom and gloom, because it's happened in the past. The Inca civilization in South America, that failed essentially because of the failure of its agricultural system, because it was quite intensive. But perhaps more familiar to many of us would be the failure of the so-called Fertile Crescent, that land between the Euphrates and the Tigris River in the Middle East. Used to be one of the most fertile regions in the world. It was the cradle of civilization. Look at it now. We are sending thousands and thousands of sheep to that region because that region is desertified. And so there are many examples in history of how we have ruined the land that we use, and that is a grave danger here in Australia. The introduction of sheep and cattle has been, in some respects, quite disastrous for the economic and efficient utilization of the land, basically because we want too much out of it. And that it works some years, it doesn't work other years. It's very risky. And of course our climate here in Australia is extremely changeable. And I noticed that more than anyone, perhaps, because I came from England where, it rains almost every other day, and I've been astounded by the fact that it'll rain for 3 months and then you don't see any rain for 3 years here. It's very variable. So, yeah, I think there's great dangers ahead.
Mm. Well, Clive, that was my longest ever response to a quick question, I think. Fascinating, though. So, don't eat animals, basically, is the message. Danger lies ahead. It's folly. So what are you working on next?
Yeah, we've been working on the live trade quite extensively. And we'll continue to do some of that, I'm sure. But our attention has been turning in recent years increasingly to animal welfare issues in Asia. We've been working in Southeast Asia and China, training people to improve the welfare of their animals, doing a lot of research to look at how that can be done most effectively. What we're hoping to do, if our support from philanthropic organisations continues, is to set up hubs of animal welfare interest across Asia, focusing on the various species that are important. So that's one of our next biggest projects. We do quite a lot of companion animal work in shelters. And increasingly I get drawn into considerations of where does our sphere of interest of animal welfare concerns lie. You know, what do we think about invertebrate welfare, for example? How did animal life evolve, and what does that teach us about what we owe to animals is a subject that's interesting me a lot at the moment. There's still plenty of things to get involved in.
To do. So where can people find out more about your work?
Hop on the website for the Centre for Animal Welfare and Ethics for the University of Queensland. That has some of it. We try increasingly to publish our work in journals that are open access so everyone can look at those. And we publish quite regularly in a relatively new journal, Animals, which I edit as well, but all my papers, I can assure everyone, are extensively reviewed by outside people. But I do think it's so important that the information gets out to the general public as well as just to scientists. And so have a look at Animals, which is an MDPI journal.
Wonderful. Well, Clive, thank you so much for coming on Knowing Animals. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter. You can follow me at SO_S. You can also like me on Facebook at Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan, or you can like the Facebook page for the podcast, which of course is called Knowing Animals. Also, don't forget to leave us a review at iTunes. iTunes really needs reviews or else we slip down in the rankings. So leaving a review makes it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.